So we're on to chapter 13. Now, this week's chapter is a complicated one, not so much because the language is complicated as much as because this is probably the most debated chapter in the history of study. I would argue that this is the most debated, misunderstood, and overcomplicated chapter in the Bible. And I think that I'd be right in saying this because there's not a whole lot of new stuff into it, but its implications are massive, and that's why I've written 21 pages. That's why everybody has discussed it ad infinitum. So we're looking at the connection between Daniel chapter 8 and John's previous statements. And John starts off in this chapter and says, "Then I stood on the sands of the sea." Now, by using the word "then," he's connecting this chapter to the previous events with the woman and the dragon. So he's not separating them. He's saying, after I saw the situation with the woman and the dragon and the attempt to eat her and that sort of stuff, I want to tell you that after that I stood on the sands of the sea. And I saw a beast rise up out of the sea. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. On its horns were 10 crowns, and on its heads were a blasphemous name. On its heads was a blasphemous name, plural. Now the beast I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like the feet of a bear, its mouth like the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So this is a connection to the same beast that we've seen before, but this is a reinterpretation a little bit. This is the dragon no longer acting in his own right, but he's giving power and authority and throne to a new beast. And so John, as if to take us through what he had done with the woman, he sort of intertwines the beast and the dragon together with the fight against the woman. Here he's sort of taking a step back and separating them off and saying, okay, I want to explain to you how they fit together. I'm going to speed over quite a few bits here. We're not going to go into the details on the Roman Church because we've done that a lot. But we need to look at this beast in some level of detail. And it says, the beast came up, had 7 heads, and it had 10 horns. And on its horns were 10 crowns, and each of its heads had a blasphemous name. Now, we've already identified the great power that this beast uses. Firstly, we'll take a step back. It says it was like a leopard. Now, if we go back to Daniel 7, we remember that this is a power that has swiftness and cunning. We remember that it has a connection to Babylon through the feet of a bear, which means that it's based itself on that same foundation. It's basing itself on the same foundation. And it's got a mouth like a lion, a fierce, commanding, dominant, loud voice. Right? It can be heard everywhere. It strikes fear into everyone's hearts. And again, if we remember that this is a connection to the Roman Church, it's a swift church because it is everywhere. The universal church is right. It's able to get in everywhere. It's cunning. It's able to think about its way through things. It bases itself on the Babylonian mysteries foundation, as we've discussed through the first 2 chapters. And it is power. If you've got the keys to heaven and hell, which is what most people believe through the Middle Ages, you have the authority, the commanding mouth like a lion. But when we say that it gave him its power and its throne, we can go into that in some detail, but we've already done that. The first church, of course, got its power by the Roman Empire. The dragon gave him its power. A pagan power gave the Roman Empire, papal Rome its power, either through Milvian Bridge, through Justinian when he handed them over. It gave him its throne because the Roman Church was given the title of Pontifex Maximus by the Roman Empire, and of course it gave its authority. So the authority in this case is a delegation of a large portion of the world's affairs for Europe. And we say Europe because this is the beast that comes up out of the sea. And this is an important matter for chapter 13 because the sea and the earth are the 2 separations we saw back in chapter 11, which started this section through, and now we're seeing the sea and the earth become important. We identified the sea, if you remember, with European powers, with those old authorities. And it's important here because as well, these 7 heads are really the 7 time frames for this beast, right? As we look through this, the 7 heads here could equate to the 7 seats, the 7 hills of Rome, which is what we talked about in the last lesson. But here, when we move forward with this, we see Yeah, I can leave that part out. We can. That's just more about the details here. But if we go on and keep reading in the chapter, it says, "I saw one of the heads as if it had been mortally wounded." So, if one of the heads are mortally wounded, what does that matter to the rest of the beast? What does that matter for everything else? These 7 heads come up in order. The first head's followed by the second, followed by the third. This is not a beast that literally has 7 heads. It's a beast that has 7 different forms, 7 different developments, 7 different types, which is why each of the heads has a crown and each of the heads has a horn, because horns, of course, mean powers and principalities. We've got a difference here from the Daniel chapter 8 beast, where we see that this is a spiritual power. Right? This is the spiritual powers that have come up. This is not a literal arms, authority, fight, murder beast. This is a spiritual beast. And so when we look at this in the terms of a spiritual beast, we can see that these 7 powers can make some sense. If we look from what we talked about in Revelation 2 and 3, the different influences that came in through the papal Roman Empire came from Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and pagan Rome. Pagan Rome, of course, being an amalgamation of the others. But those all in their type are the ones that influenced the papal Rome, the Rome of the papacy, in what they were trying to develop. That's where their powers came from. So this beast that ends up with a mortal wound, which again we've already seen before, is a beast that stretches through a huge amount of time. It stretches through a huge amount of interaction with God's people. And John, like we've seen before, is combining what we have seen in chapter 8 with the different, with the Jews and the Christians as if they were the same group. He's not dividing off and saying that this interaction started with the Jews and then later on took on with the Christians. He's saying these are simply all God's people. These are all God's people working together. Are you still with me?
Mm-hmm.
Right, so he's saying, I saw one of these heads, one of these 7 heads that had horns and crowns and such. And again, we've got 10 crowns, we've got 10 horns. So there are 10 leaders that are a part of this. This isn't just one type of leadership. And when we remember, Egypt had 2 different forms that it existed in. Greece had pre-Grecian and pre-Roman and post-Roman Greece. So this is one of these particular heads, and it would have to, in fact, be the last one of these heads that came up, that took a mortal wound. And we've seen this mortal wound before, a wound that was very deadly. But the deadly wound, of course, was healed. And the world responded and said, well, who is like the beast? They worshipped the dragon, who gave its authority. They worshipped the beast and said, who is like this power and who is able to make war with him? I don't need to go back through the connection between the mortal wound. We've already seen that the mortal wound relates to that participation, that connection. We've seen the connection in Daniel chapter 11, where he says, "I'll give power to my 2 witnesses before the beast is put down and before freedom is given." But what we need to look at is that this mortal wound causes everybody to marvel after the beast. They all worship him, and they worship the dragon who gave him his authority. And they say, who can actually make war with him? Now, if we remember from what we were discussing before, since 1870, the Roman Church has been more or less just locked in Rome. It doesn't have any military force of its own. It doesn't have anything that's there today. Who can actually make war with the papacy today? You can't go into Rome and try and take over the papacy. Even the Nazis didn't do that. They said, we'll take over Rome after they broke up with the Italians, but they said, we'll leave the papacy separate. We're not going to try and fight the church. We're going to simply let the church be. We're not going to have any of these sorts of interactions. I'm going through this quickly because we've seen this all before. And John's connection here. Now, John, again, has already discussed this in his last 2 chapters, right? We've seen that this deadly wound has fit into what we've seen in chapter 11. I'll give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days. There's a sign in heaven that the woman is there ready to give birth, and she flees, and there was the dragon was in range with the woman. We've seen this part before, but where's this bit going? I can't remember what I've written now. But here's the connection. The connection with this is when he's written what he's put in Daniel chapter 7, where, if you remember from chapter 10, we concluded John's taking part of this story in this direction through this spiritual line. He's not splitting all this stuff up. He's not splitting up all these bits and pieces. So we're still connected to these two witnesses and to this woman in the thing. So he's not splitting everything up. He's built to this point using Daniel's language, but it's never actually been stated what stopped that beast from persecuting the witnesses or the woman. In these earlier chapters, when we have this thing, there's never actually a statement where it says they were stopped because of the deadly wound. It just says after they died, then the beast descended out of their bottomless pit. After the woman suddenly stopped attacking. This is where we find in Daniel chapter 7 this connection to what John has said. John is assuming his audience knows what Daniel said. Have I gone too far? Have I messed up there a bit? Or are you still with me?
Keep going. Yeah.
Keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So in Daniel he says the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on earth, which is going to be different from all the others and will devour the earth, the temple, and break it into pieces. Those 10 horns are 10 kings, which will arise from his kingdom. And another comes after them, who will be the one that will subdue them. He shall speak pompous works above the Most High, persecute the saints, and intend to change times and lords. Then the saints will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. We remember this from chapter 7, where we said the saints, the good people, are given over to the Roman papacy for the 1260 days. But the court then will be seated. And the court, who is the court? The court that takes away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. The court is the court of heaven, who takes away his power. Then the kingdom and dominion, the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole earth, are given to the people, to the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions will serve and obey him. That is Christ. So, in as far as Daniel is concerned, there is a point that comes with this after the saints are given into his hands, after this 1260-day period is concluded, when a court seats and they take away his dominion. And Daniel concludes it there, saying that from that point onward, this massive power never resurrects itself in the way that it was. His kingdom and dominion they take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. And it's given to the saints of the Most High. Now, we've seen this connection in what we've looked at before with the defeat of Rome in 1798, and we've seen it in the rise of Protestantism throughout the world. Protestants are the ones who have always had the protest, where the name comes from, against the Roman Church on a variety of different topics. So the protests start in that sort of a way, and they say, we're not going to listen to what you have to say. So insofar as Daniel is concerned, the courts of heaven take away his power. God judges these people. And Daniel says that the power of the beast is given to the peoples of the saints of the Most High. A strangely democratic phrase, which is given 75 years before democracy rose in Greece. It's a really interesting way that he says that. He says, to the people, the saints of the Most High. Now, from Daniel's perspective, Daniel went into Babylon about 605 BC, and the first Athenian leader, Cleisthenes, introduced Democratica, or the rule of the people, in about 507. So if we assume Daniel wrote 25 years after he started, this is about 75 years before the concept of a people being able to give judgment, a people being able to give a judgment pattern. Daniel is writing this about 75 years before the idea that the people could have power. So the question that comes, who were the people that took over this when the courts are seated? Who is given the dominion from this group? Well, they persecuted Sabbatarians heavily, and the winners, of course, were the French. But the French, we have to remember, were atheists. The biggest winners from the 1798 crash were the Protestant forces, the Jews and the atheistic rebels, who had been the threat to the Roman Church before. So when we look at these verses, that this dominion is taken away and this deadly wound is inflicted, we have to remember who these wounds are being inflicted by. They're being inflicted by a group of people that are completely opposed to the Roman Church, yet somehow in that opposition to the Roman Church, the devil, the dragon, is being worshipped. If we go back to the text here, I saw one of its heads that had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And the world marveled and followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon who gave the authority to the beast. They gave it because this deadly wound was healed, but they also marveled that this wound could be inflicted in the first place, because who is like the beast and who's able to make war with him? So there's a few different layers to this going on as we look at this text. This mortal wound being inflicted in the first place was something that they thought was impossible, because the dragon had given him his authority. His dragon has given him his seat, his power, and his throne. So as we look at this, we have to look at how these things are going through. And John continues, I saw one of its heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and the deadly wound was healed. So they worshipped the dragon who gave the authority to the beast, saying, who's able to make war with him? Now, if Heaven Court takes away the beast's authority, why do people worship the dragon because of it? And if we look at what happened to the Roman Church, we remember that Napoleon's authority, avowedly atheistic authority, was the one that took it away, and then there was a reorganization. And if we look at the changes in practice that came from that moment, there was a major separation between government and religion from that point. From the point of Berthier conquering the Pope in 1798, there was a separation from having a religion that's a part of the state. Now, in England today, the Queen is supposedly head of the English Church, and in theory she's able to direct its affairs. But in practice, she leads those elements to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in the same way, the 26 bishops elected of the established Church of England that sit in the House of Lords, the Lord Spiritual, are often consulted on spiritual matters, but they have no real authority anymore. They don't have the casting votes like they would have 300 years ago. There is a moral voice, but with the addition of 2 rabbis and I think 4 Protestants, even their connection to the Church of England has now been lost. So there's this big push away from this idea of connecting the church and the state. And this is what as I said, we saw this in Rome. And so the populaces themselves, again since 1798, have seen a resurgence in being able to choose what type of governance and what type of religion they want. The majority of people today consider themselves to have some sort of religious feelings, but it would be extremely difficult for a group to support a religious war today. It would be very, very difficult for anybody to support a religious war. But when we take a step back and remember, what's the devil's point on earth? The devil's point is not to bring power to him. The devil's point is to take power away from Christ. The devil's point has never been to win souls for himself. That's mysticism made up by Dante. The devil's point has always been to try and take people away from Christ. If he can make you question your faith, if he can make you question and doubt what you preach and teach, what you believe, he's won. That's his victory. His victory isn't found in taking people out of the church. His victory is found in taking people intellectually away from Jesus. So as he just leads them astray a little tiny bit, abandon that tiny little thing, abandon the tiny principle, he wins. And that's where this part of this chapter has really not been understood. Jesus said himself in Matthew 7, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many that go to you in by it. But narrow is the gate and difficult the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it." The dragon simply needs to move God out of the sightline of most people. And from 1798 to today, he has done that in a huge way. But it is still curious that John says, who can make war with this? And this is the question. People are not going to support a Roman Catholic war, or a war on a religious ground, or a war on any of those sorts of things. It doesn't matter what it is. And people are so quickly distracted away from religion by anything else going on. You know, sexual scandals, the Nazis, dealing with fascists, anybody else. Nobody will stand against the Pope saying, well, this is the right moral way to do things. But even the Pope and the papacy today is under a huge attack from these sorts of things. There's stories about Pope Benedict being arrested because he's wanted back in Germany. There's discussions about taxes, and the current Pope Francis has certainly got an interesting history with fascists in Argentina. These are all distractions that are trying to lead people away from even the basic principle of saying he's a good moral man trying to teach a good moral truth, but he's got a past. And that's something that we will discuss a little bit more as we go. Are you still with me? Have I lost you? I've said a lot there. Are you still with me?
Yep.
Okay. And he, that is the beast that was wounded, was given a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies. He was given the authority to continue for 42 months, and then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was given to him to make war with the saints, to overcome them, and authority was given over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth or worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain for the foundation of the world. Now, we've already seen the 42 months before. 42 months we remember from Daniel chapter 11, the 1260 days, the time and a half of time. I'm not going to labour the point on going through a lot of this because we've been through it so many times and I think you're getting annoyed with me bashing the Catholics. But if we go very quickly, blaspheme against God, the Pope claims the title of Vicar of Christ, Vicarius Christi, which literally means he stands as the substitute of Christ. Blaspheme his name, everything the church done is supposedly in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Go back to chapters 2 and 3. Blaspheme his tabernacle. If you've been into a Catholic church, you've seen the venerations of Mary, crucifixes, foreign gods on the walls, ad nauseum. Those who dwell in heaven, I've got some notes here. We did talk about making saints and such. Again, when John Paul II made Josimar Escavara a saint, he said it's by our own authority that we declare and define Blessed Jamara and we inscribe his name on the catalogue of saints. I'm not going to go back through that. We've seen the connection between the 42 months. We've seen this. We've seen how he's made war with the saints. And those saints are those who are written in this book. So, sorry?
Marilyn's just delivered lunch to me. And
it's being shaky.
And it's better than you'd get at a restaurant.
Me too, please. So we'll move. We'll leave that ground if you're okay with me just leaving that where it is. Okay.
Yep.
So if anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity will go into captivity. He who kills with a sword must be killed with a sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. So he's drawn this connection to this phrase, the patience of the saints, and the statements about captivity to reinforce that those saints have their salvation. The faith of the saints as well as the patience of the saints. These again, as we saw in the last chapter, fear neither captivity nor death. They are ready for Christ to return. They have no fear of any of this stuff in those 42 months. They are happy. But then John sees another beast coming up out of the earth, who had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. Now, I always spent quite a lot of time wondering how that would look, and then I don't know whether you've seen the recent the Boba Fett film, but there are several beasts that rise up out of the earth in that physically. So there are ways you can envision that. But as we discussed in chapter 10, the beast that comes out of the earth is distinctly different from everything that comes before it. It's different from all the other things that have been discussed in Daniel. Daniel doesn't talk about this beast at all. It's distinctly different from everything that had happened before it. It doesn't come from the areas conquered by Rome, Egypt, Assyria, Greece, or Babylon. It comes from a different part of the world from this Eurasian continent. So to identify this beast, we have to consider its qualities. So who is this beast, this second beast of Revelation 13? One of the most debated questions in history. Now, as we discussed previously, Daniel links up horns to leaders or kings. So this beast has 2 horns, but they are small horns. They are like a lamb's horns. They're not powerful horns. So there are 2 leaders that have little authority or little influence. And it speaks like a dragon, powerful, loud, deceptive, aggressive, unafraid to offend and use cutting words. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. So this beast works along with the first beast. He exercises the authority of that first beast. He discusses the bad things of the first beast. He's authorized to do the same blasphemies that the dragon has given him power to do. What this means is somewhat unclear. How do you exercise authority in his presence? That's something we're not sure about. And there's quite a few things in here. We're starting to step into that area where things become less and less certain. In his presence is a rather complicated phrase. This thing that he does things in his presence. That's not really clear. But it's a limited base about what authority is delegated to this beast. He's able to do it in his presence means he's not able to exercise all the authority all the time. He's not able to do all the authority things, but if he's got the mouth of a dragon, he can speak however he likes whenever he wants. He causes the earth to dwell and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast. So he's going to be aligning himself back with that first beast power, back with that connection. He aligns himself with that, the Roman Catholic authority. And this also means that it has to arrive around about the time the deadly wound was healed. If he's doing it because this deadly wound was healed, right, it causes them to dwell to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. This rising up out of the earth can't happen much before that 1798 period. It has to happen around that sort of time frame. It also rules out England as one of those connections, which we'll have a look at in a later analysis. He performs great signs, so that he can even make fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men. So he's not just doing things that happen and people are talking about it, but people are seeing this. People are actually experiencing this. And if we assume that there's no such thing as magic, this means that he has a power over natural forces, over really interesting forces, and possibly even over technologies that makes this beast a really impressive feat. And so this makes fire come down from heaven sounds a bit more literal to me than it does technological, but we'll have a look at that as we come to it. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he granted to do in the sight of the beast. So again, authority is limited about how much magic, in inverted commas, he can do. Telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. He orders the world to actually establish some sort of an image. The word image here would be representation. We've often taken it to be statue, but it could be analysis, it could be power, it could be authority. We'll have a look at that as we come to it. Whatever these signs are, they're done with the purpose specifically of deceiving the world. They're done with the purpose of actually attaching people back to the sight of that beast, and so that they can bring their attention back to that beast. So this power that raises up from the earth claims the authority of the first beast, of the Roman Church, does magical, in inverted commas, things in the sight of that beast, or while it's with that beast, has power over much great things. He performs great signs in the sight of men, so on his own he does powerful things, exercises the authority of the first guy, and he has 2 horns and a mouth like a dragon. Who is this second beast? So,
and he comes out of the earth.
And he comes up out of the earth. So let's take a step back and work out who this is. It comes up out of the earth, so it can't be from Eurasia. That rules out England from the start. It rules out England from the get-go. It has 2 horns like a lamb's. I've just gone through this. Right. Identifying this beast has been extremely difficult. And we have to be clear when we say that we still don't know with absolute surety what this power is. We don't know with an absolute certainty what this authority is. But something that is interesting is the way it says it has 2 horns like a lamb. Now, horns, remember, represent princes or leaders. But if these princes are weak and lamb-like, it could mean that there is a split in power for this particular thing. Something like when Rome was a powerful authority, when Rome had its empire and such, it had an emperor at the top who had all authority, but it still had 2 consuls. It still had 2 leaders that were elected that could vie with it for itself. So we could And the best theory we have is that we're looking at a democratic power here. One where the two leaderships or the two structures sort of vie for their own authority or vie for their own dominance, for lack of a better term. The best answer, and this is not the only answer, but the best answer we have seen... Sorry?
United States.
Yep. J.N. Andrews, who was our first missionary, analysed this passage in some great deal and came to the conclusion the best answer was the combination of the United States of America linked with what we call apostate Protestantism. That is Protestantism that is not following the Sabbatarian truth, that has close links to the Roman Catholic Church, but that also has its independence from the Roman Catholic Church. We justify it in this way. It comes up out of the earth. America is far from Europe and Asia. All right? It came from a conglomeration of the three main European nations, England, France, and Spain, and it shares a lot of their characteristics, but it also shares their religious sensibilities. The two horns, America is a bicameral legislature, it has two houses of parliament, and they have to pass laws together before anything becomes legal. It's also dominated by two political parties, although that is a lesser perspective to me. The executive is the weakest branch in the American system, whereas in the Roman system it was the most powerful. But more than that, America has had a civil war. America has had a major civil war, and there are still strong tensions between North and South. The idea of liberty in America means choice, and people can choose which aspect they want to. And that is another key thing. This idea that the democracy in America means they can choose almost anything in their society that they want to. Almost anything in their society that they need to. So, the best thing we can go through here is that these two horns like a lamb refer to the two sides of American power struggle, where the center speaks like a dragon. The other two keep themselves very weak, keep themselves very separate from the whole world. Now, none of the other powers that we've discussed were democratic in the same form. The Babylonians, Medes, Persians, and Greeks, in the Greek structure that we've seen, were all autocratic kingdoms, while Rome was a tribal oligarchy. It was a form of a democracy, but it was very tribal, and it was an autocracy under the empire. The papacy today is still an elected autocracy. He has a limitation by the Roman Curia or the College of Cardinals, but he is still an autocrat. He's still a separate autocracy.
Why have you got speaks in brackets?
Because the language in the actual text is, where am I? Spoke.
Oh,
so
okay.
I'm just changing. Yeah, I'm just being very, very clear that I'm changing the tense, but not the language. So when we say he speaks like a dragon, the language used by the United States is fierce. It's aggressive. It's unyielding. You only have to look at the rhetoric we've seen in the last couple of days over Ukraine to understand that. Why? Now, I believe in freedom, and I don't want to go into the debate about Ukraine, but the United States is literally the other side of the world from the Ukraine. It will not affect them in any way, shape, or form if Russia conquers Ukraine. Yet, if you look at Biden, who's probably the most peaceful of the American leaders we've seen since Jimmy Carter, and he is speaking fiercely, aggressively, unyieldingly like a dragon against Russia in this situation. He's trying to put the laws of his country on the rest of the world. He doesn't care if he offends the Russians. He doesn't care if he offends anybody. So, despite this power is able to actually speak like a dragon, but he's also speaking against himself. If you look at the laws in America, they have a clear separation between church and state. Yet most presidents have spoken about their religious views. The last one, and the Republican Party holds the religious right as its base. The last president, Donald Trump, was the first since the Second World War, who hasn't had a strong religious background of all the candidates we've seen. And the United States also, as I just said, sticks its nose where it's not wanted. You know, it's stepped in, since the Second World War, it's been the world's policeman. You know a lot about that, David, with, you know, discussions around the first Iraq War and those sorts of things, Cold War tensions, even things like the Falkland Islands or the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. When Joseph Kony was on TV, that means nothing to the United States, and yet the United States put its name in there.
Yeah, it's the same as when they went into Iraq and said they had weapons of destruction.
Yeah,
And then
weapons
they
of
went
mass
in there
destruction.
and all they found was pipes. And they said, they were threaded like gun barrels.
Yep.
But that's all they found. There was no weapons of mass destruction. It was just America wanted to get in there for the oil.
And they had an interest there, but they used all these things which were outside of their concern, the United Nations and such, to try and push their way in. You're absolutely right, you know. Now,
Yep.
the key thing that separates the United States here from the other powers that may fit the bill, specifically the other democracies, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, is that though those nations are predominantly English and French, they don't conduct themselves in this way. This right here is that biggest difference between pretty much any other nation outside of the Eurasian spectrum that you can really look at. If you look at China, for example, China is another one that often comes up in discussion. But China, although it likes to react to things, is almost never proactive. It's aggressive, certainly, but it doesn't speak like a dragon. When Xi Jinping gets on TV, he likes to say, you people have done wrong because you're idiots. But he won't get on there and say, you people are idiots. He will react to something. He won't aggressively move forward against something. And frankly, other than China and America, no other power outside of that Eurasian bubble is big enough to fit this bill. No other power really outside is big enough to fit this bill, except for possibly Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So we don't like sticking our nose into the rest of the world's affairs like the US does. When the Solomons recently, when Tonga had its tsunami recently, we sent equipment over there immediately, but we aren't going to be staying there for political gain or anything else. We're not going to be building naval bases. We're not going to be doing that in the way that the Americans do. So those two big points really can only point to the United States. We'll come to the apostate Protestantism in a second, but does that make sense to what I'm saying? Have you got any alternative theories there? Because there's not many that make a lot of sense.
No, it makes sense to me.
No.
So when we look at the timing, it has to arise at least as an individual authority around 1798. The United States Constitution was voted and passed in 1798. The United States Constitution was voted and passed in 1789, which was 13 years after their Declaration of Independence in 1776. And their war for independence nominally ended in 1783. That was when the Treaty of Paris was made and the United States became an independent kingdom recognized by the United Kingdom and France. However, there were a huge swathe of matters that were not dealt with in that treaty that had remained and left over. And in reality, any historian worth their salt will tell you that the War of 1812 was the Second War of American Independence. The War of 1812 started over border tensions between America and Canada. The English reinforced their forces and wanted to regain some of the American territories. The United States wanted to just remove any allegiance. They had a border war. The Americans came in and burnt the White House down. You can still see the soot marks if you go there today. And then the Treaty of Ghent in 1815 fixed the conclusion. And from the Treaty of Ghent in 1815, the United States had no concerns about Britain whatsoever. It was a strategic war that nobody really won. It was more or less a status quo antebellum. But this is the moment when the war, the Americans more or less separated completely. So before 1776, the US didn't exist. By 1815, the US was a fledgling nation that was able to take off. And that influence of American exceptionalism, as they call it, was really not dented until Vietnam. So 1798 fits nicely in the middle of those time frames. And the US, with the exception of its own civil war, really stayed out of the international scene until the First World War, which they came into very reluctantly. But as I said, from the Second World War, they have played a massive part in everything. So the time frame fits. As an individual power, they arose around 1798, around this moment when the papacy was inflicted its deadly wound. The Western civilization of the United States also is able to perform great signs. If we look at just the pure technology we're using right now to have this conversation, almost everything we're doing here, except for the Wi-Fi that the three of us are using, is built on American technology. Wi-Fi was invented by the CSIRO here in Australia, and they won a court case over it a little while ago. But almost everything we're looking at is based on American systems. The three of us are I'm assuming we're all using... Are you using a Mac, David, or are you using a Windows computer?
Windows.
So the three of us are using Microsoft-based systems, which is an American company, where the hardware may be made in China, but it's designed primarily in a combination of the United States and Taiwan. The internet systems were pioneered by the United States through Sir Tim Berners-Lee and a few of those fellows who built on the existing systems that the US already had built. Signs and wonders are an easy way to just look at all sorts of technologies. Medical technologies, we can cure a lot of cancers. John, you had a little bit of surgery recently. I don't know who developed those techniques, but I guarantee the Americans were involved in some way. Even simple matters like blood transfusion took the number of people that died from just loss of blood, whereas blood transfusions were invented by an American named Dr. Charles Drew. Do you know the story of Charles Drew?
No.
Brilliant doctor. He was he invented the system of splitting off blood so that you could take the blood plasma, which you can give to anybody, from the blood name cells, and then taking the blood name cells and giving them to specific people. Absolutely brilliant doctor. He unfortunately died in the early 1950s. He had a major car accident, and he ironically died from loss of blood. They took him to the Chicago hospital, but they wouldn't let him in. The hospital was for whites only.
Trade.
If you need to know another thing about American divisions, there's another one of those two little horns fighting at each other all the time. The racism in America is palpable, right? But these sorts of inventions that the Americans have come up with are fantastic. And then you go into military technology. The last century and a half have seen incredible developments, from simple things like two-way radios through to multiple independent intercontinental ballistic missiles. And that's where we get this interesting phrase, to make fire come down from heaven. There's a lot of ways you could interpret this, but to make fire come down from heaven could be simply rockets that, when they come down to have a safe landing, look like fireballs. Bombs containing napalm, harm explosives. They could refer to some future technology. The Americans are experimenting with lasers, where they will literally set sections of the air on fire and make them come down to land on enemy targets. That's not outside of the realm of possibility. There are many options for the interpretations of this passage. Personally, I think this would refer to a technology we haven't seen yet. My way of reading that looks a little bit too much like it's a non-technical thing, but, you know, there would be a technology behind it. But then we get into some areas that it hasn't done. It hasn't exercised the power of the first beast. It hasn't positioned itself in a religious way. It has tried to exercise itself as a spiritual power, where it's trying to win hearts and minds. But it hasn't stepped into that spiritual realm, and especially when we consider that the current law in the United States actually would prevent that. And that's the major flaw in this identification as the United States as this beast that comes up out of the earth. The First Amendment to the Constitution says, Congress will make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So, Congress makes no law that respects the establishment of any type of religion or prohibiting the free exercise of religion. And that is one of those big lines that's in the American Constitution that would have to be changed for a few of these things to happen. If it's going to exercise the power, which is an objectively spiritual power of the first beast, that line there would have to change. But the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol, was repealed by the 22nd. So it's not outside of the realms of possibility. It's been done before. And there have been a lot of presidents who've attempted to use Christian roots to their advantage. In 2017, the President Trump attempted to ban all travel to the United States from Muslim-dominated countries, and he did it on explicitly religious grounds. He claimed national security against Muslims. Now, he's a president. He's not part of Congress. So there are ways around the First Amendment if there's enough will to be able to do it. This was challenged in the courts, and it was ultimately suspended, but it was not suspended as an anti-Muslim move. It was suspended because the courts decided that the president had to have more influence with Congress to be able to do that. And any president or any leader you see has religious rhetoric going on with them. If you look at the language that they use, they will all use religious rhetoric to their support, both the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans are better at it, but all of the politicians use religious rhetoric in their speeches and in their things. So despite the amendment saying that they are not allowed to make laws respecting religion, the American politicians always try and back themselves up in that religious language. They try and use religious language to their advantage. You understand what I mean by that? They try and say, God wills us to do this. What's her name? One of the politicians a little while ago said that God had told her to run for president. And everybody sort of said, that's absolutely crazy. One friend that I had said, I'd like to ask her what God's voice sounds like. Michelle Buckman, that's it. Michelle Buckman said that God had told her to run for president. Well, ask her what God's voice sounds like. I'd like to know. As for this image, we'll have a look at that in this next section. He was granted power, that's the image, that's the beast, was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast. Breath, a form of life, a form of existence, a form of ability to survive, that the image of the beast should speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Here's where we get into the intricacies of the language, because this is where things are misunderstood and mistranslated a little bit. The beast was granted power to give life, breath, the only thing that only God can give life, to the image of the beast. This is the image that he set up to reflect the first beast. If we go back here, he deceives everyone, telling them to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword. So this is the thing that he sets up to reflect or to imitate or as an homage to the beast that was wounded by the sword and lived. So the power that he gives him to exist is a power that really only God should have. Only God can create power. Where am I? Yeah. Only God can create life. But that's not specifically what's being given here. It just says breath, so that it's able to speak and cause. Now, to speak means that it can actually enunciate, but cause is would require an intellectual exchange. It would require the ability to push people, to make people do things, to give instructions, to give commands. This image thing is something that is set up in homage to the Catholic Church, but is something that would be worshipped itself, as many as would not worship the image of the beast. Something that becomes its own form of power, its own thing that will separate itself off. So this is not causing people to worship the first beast. This is causing people to worship itself, supported by or backed up by this American power. This is a rather strange thing. Now, historically, we've attempted to interpret this as apostate Protestantism. That is, Protestant churches that accept the Sunday Sabbath rather than Saturday, as well as other of the commandments that the Roman Church seems to violate. Non-Roman churches generally do follow Roman practices when it comes to the first, second, third, and fourth commandment. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, where the Roman Church has Mary, and so on and so forth. Most importantly, in our church's dogma is the fourth, the Sabbath. But any church that attempts to change the scriptures or accepts those changes made by Constantine is still following the Roman leadership against the scriptures, and by definition is outside of God's power, is outside of God's word, is by definition apostate. So in this model, this image, this creation, this thing that reflects the first beast, is set up so that it itself can be worshipped, but is not necessarily going back to the first beast. But it also includes a persecuting power. As many as who would not worship the image could be killed. as many as would not bring its own worship to it could be killed. This image is a complicated one, and that language, I want to be so clear on this, it's so important here that language is in the Greek. Here it is in the Greek, and it should cause that as many as, if not would worship the image of the beast, would worship the image of the beast. So I want to be very, very clear. In the original Greek, it's as clear as mud that it's as clear as day, sorry, that this image is demanding people that would worship it. So it's not separating itself off. Now, again, the American Constitution seems to prevent this from being possible. The American Constitution says it will reflect no law. But wouldn't changing the Constitution, wouldn't changing their basic rule of law, their basic rule of structure, to be able to establish some sort of a church of the United States in the same way the Church of England has in that country, actually be a pretty impressive model of saying, well, hey, we can set up our own church, we can set up our own thing, and it becomes its own little monster in and of itself. It becomes its own mechanism that this power can use, that would have its own authority, like the judicial system or the courts have in America, separate from everything else. So it would be a part of this power, but have its own independence to be able to structure itself. And it wouldn't need to worship the Roman Church. It would simply have to be a form of Protestantism. Protestantism that could then align itself with the Roman Church for political maneuvers and say a war with the Muslim powers or some other Cassius Belli. But it's not impossible to see how these things would be able to link themselves up. Now, this is in the realms of future. This is certainly in the realms of future. But what is clear from my interpretation of this text is that this image to the beast sets itself up as a third power almost, a third established group, so that it itself stands somewhat apart from the first beast, somewhat apart from the second beast, but aligned with those two as well. Certainly getting power from the second beast, but aligning itself in the direction of the first. Now John's I think is busting to say something, because that sort of breaks what we usually preach, but does that make sense to you? Are you okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard the notion of a Church of America, but it, just like you paralleled it with the Church of England, it is very plausible.
It certainly makes sense.
But how many sort of breakaway churches have risen up out of America already?
Hundreds. But none of them
that's what I mean.
But none of them have governmental authority. None of them are backed by government.
Yeah, but you've only got to get one that sort of all of a sudden gets backed by government.
And that's it. As soon as you get one that's backed by government, and they start to change laws and say, okay, now you have to be killed if you don't participate in this particular structure. And it's even not, while it says to be killed, it's not necessarily a persecuting power, as we'll see in the next section with the mark of the beast. It's that they are killed as a result of not worshipping. So if we look at how this next bit goes, there's just a follow-on through, but it still would require a pretty impressive change, both in the American governmental structure as well as in the American societal structure, because at the moment they're all about freedom and liberty. So that would be a very big thing to change. You with me on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I reckon it's starting to change now. Look at it. They've raided the Blue and White House.
I know. Well,
just because they lost the election.
And that's it. And we have always seen that when democracies fall, they're almost always replaced with autocracies. We saw that with Hitler, when the democracy, as weak as it was with the Weimar Republic, fell. Hitler came in and took over and simply put whatever rules through. When the French fell as a democracy, which we've talked about it quite heavily, it became Napoleon's autocracy. You're absolutely right. And so if a religious leader, God forbid Mike Pence, comes in, who is a avowed and staunch religionist, all of a sudden you've got something to play with. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So you can see this is outside of the realms of possibility.
No, that's right.
And if anything, we're more likely to see this sort of thing. I would say that today, since I first heard these views, 25 years ago, I would say that we could accept this as a perspective and a possibility a lot more today than 25 years ago. Is that fair to say,
yes.
John?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a lot of information. Are you okay with what I've said there?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, so next bit is where we start stepping into the real heavy debate. He, that is this image, causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or in their foreheads, and no one may buy or sell except who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now, this is where the Adventist conspiracy theories go absolutely ballistic, and this is where we get into the real fun. We've ended a comment that mirrors our analysis of Revelation chapter 7, the mark of God. The he is somewhat ambiguous, but it should refer to, as to whether or not it refers to the beast of the earth or the image. But if we remember that the image is using the beast's power, it's kind of irrelevant. So this image has to construct some way for everybody, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be marked so that they can't buy or sell anything who hasn't got their establishment. Now, the United States surely doesn't do this. Surely the United States is pretty open to everybody going out and doing whatever they want, and they'll support everybody. But then we come to something called the Mexico policy, which is also called the global gag rule. It is United States policy, as written down in the United States State Department and their foreign services, that they block any non-governmental organization or any governmental structure or any institution that receives American government funding that doesn't perform abortions, but simply speaks about or gives information about or discusses the concept of abortions, to lose their government funding immediately. It is done specifically on religious grounds. This is called the global gag rule, or the Mexico City policy. It was brought in on the 20th of January by Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan was a Republican, and the Republicans, by definition, are religious right people. However, President Bill Clinton, in January of 1993, rescinded this policy as being undemocratic. President George Bush, a Republican, reinstated it in 2001. Democratic President Barack Obama rescinded it in 2009. Donald Trump brought it back in 2017, and Joe Biden has rescinded it the last time in 2021. As a policy, the United States is using its religious ideology and the separation between these two powers, and this is just one example, to say we will give you funding or not give you funding on purely religious grounds. Whether you support abortions or not, this is a purely religious grounded policy that is floating between the two parties. And there are many, many examples of this. So the United States already imposes its will on people depending on what they believe, depending on how they believe things. And what's more, in the broader sense, the United States more or less controls commerce worldwide. When we remember the US dollar is the gold currency, it's the reserve standard for every nation. When you trade, if we live in Australia, if I want to buy something from someone in Britain, for example, I don't just trade my money for British pounds. The money that I trade for British pounds is traded compared to the value of both currencies on the US dollar. That's the simplest way that international currency works. The British pound might be worth $1.20 US cents. The Australian dollar might be worth 75 US cents. So I trade my money into US dollars, then that amount of money in US dollars gets traded into British pounds. It's the reserve currency. So at its broadest sense, the United States is the reserve currency for the world. It would not be impossible for them to restrict the use of their currency, and in fact, they do this a lot with terrorist organizations, from being able to allow countries to gain access to resources. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies have made an impact on that, but they are still have to be traded back into the regular currencies, which again are still traded on the open market with American dollars, and big international trades are not done in cryptocurrencies yet. So that may be changing, but we'll see. The language of this verse, however, is all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or foreheads. How would we be able to prevent individuals from buying and selling? That's not known. We don't have an answer for that. I'm not going to speculate on some technology, but I am going to say that John seems to imply this is worldwide compliance. And if you look at technologies like Visa and MasterCard, they are managed and controlled by the United States. The very pure technology of being able to transfer money is more or less controlled by the United States. So when you look just as simply as having a bank card that you actually do some money transactions with, this might be an Australian bank card, but that little word Visa would indicate that there's an American influence there. And that's one of the big ways that the Americans simply restrict trading, as we may shortly see with Russia. They simply say, we'll stop allowing Visa and MasterCard to be able to give good grace to your transactions. So in a worldwide domination, it's not impossible to see how the Americans can actually stop you from doing currency. What's more, we've seen in the last few years with the pandemic that people are willing to accept restrictions that would otherwise be very heavily pushed back on, and including when it comes to the access to their money. Now, much speculation has been made about RFID chips, thumbprint technologies, and all sorts of other things. I don't know how that will play out. I don't know how the actual effect of this will play out. But the one thing that we do know is we are looking at this in a spiritual context. And in a spiritual context, we discussed very, very heavily in chapter 7 that the mark of God is the Sabbath. The corresponding mark would have to be the imposition of the Sunday as the day of worship. And if we look at the image of the beast being some sort of extra-governmental authority or intergovernmental authority that is then given control over what people are allowed to do, the compliance with the law. This word compliance we've now started to use in a very heavy way. If we look at that in the structure of what we have here, you can easily see that if you're no longer in compliance with what the law says, well, we'll simply stop you from being able to use a bank. And then it doesn't matter whether the mark of the beast is physical or spiritual. If you can't use your card with your right hand, you're not going to be able to do anything. So when we bring this back into a spiritual context, if the mark of the beast is some sort of governmental structure that does things, then we have this better influence. But the other thing that the two other things that come to my mind when we look at this, one is that in China at the moment, I don't know whether you know, but they're bringing in these social laws where you get social points. It's a sort of social engineering. If you're being a bad boy and littering and stuff like that, people can report you and you can lose social points. And that sort of social interacting can actually have impacts on whether you're able to get a house loan and such like that. Whether or not that will come to the United States and be a part of this, I don't know. But the other thing that we have seen a lot, and this is very, very important for our discussion, is this idea that non-compliance is sort of ignored in some ways.
James, just excuse me a minute.
That's right, go ahead.
Tell her that it might be 3:30. So that might be half hour or so before we go to Leeds. Yeah, we're going to go to Leeds. We're going to go at 3. It's 3 now.
Sorry, we're almost done.
To Lee Hermanson. So could you just tell her that it might be 3:30? It's all good, James. Keep going.
Sorry, mate.
No problems.
This other thing we need to look at is in the recent times. I'm sure you both know examples of this idea of non-compliance. For example, did you guys wear masks in church today?
At times, but other times not.
It is law still that you have to wear masks. Did anybody say anything?
No.
There you go. We are in a position where we're seeing some non-compliance in the compliance realms. And if you look at the way that this sort of a thing would come up, if you've got a situation where your small town has the bread maker and the candlestick maker, and they know that John is the good Adventist, and he disagrees with our Sunday stuff, but he's a good bloke and we just don't care, so we're just complying because we don't care. But he's a good bloke. Look, if John gives me his money on a Tuesday and I'll sell him stuff, whatever he needs, and we can maybe it's John. So I'll tell you what, with John, he can mow my lawn and I'll give him bread. It doesn't matter that way. We'll get around these things. This idea of having a mark that is imposed on everybody always has exceptions, which is why there are three important references as we move forward in the scripture that says that this mark has to be received. The mark is a free choice. The mark in Revelation 14:9 says, anyone who worships the beast in his image and receives his mark. In 19 it says, they work signs in his presence by which he deceived those who received the mark. And in Revelation 24 it says, they had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received his mark. If you're receiving something, you're accepting it. You're making a choice to take it on. So the mark of the beast can be a combination of this technological thing that prevents people from doing stuff, but indeed as well, Mrs. White herself says, it is a mark which angels, not human eyes, can read. For the destroying angel must see the mark of redemption. It is a choice to accept that mark, which means the fear-mongering that the Adventists have seen for generations to promulgate some sort of a campaign around this mark being a secret influence is absolutely ludicrous. People will know what they are choosing to accept. This idea that the mark of the beast is some secret thing that will be suddenly brought in, you'll get an RFID chip so you can do banking and all of a sudden, oops, sorry, I didn't realise, is absolutely insane. The mark has to be received. It has to be chosen. Angels alone can read it, which means that there's ways around accepting this mark or not accepting this mark and still surviving. So while we can see that this is a technological solution to being able to buy and sell, this acceptance or rejection is a free choice. And even with the vaccine discussion, and I've got friends who refuse to take the vaccine, they are still able to participate in our society, and they are not being subjected to any major laws. So the idea that this is a literal seal, like a tattoo, may come into play. Angels would be smart enough to read RFID codes, and humans can't without some sort of special apparatus. So angels will probably be able to see the technology surrounding this mark, but the actual acceptance of the mark is something that only angels would be able to recognize. It's something only angels would be able to see. It's a literal and a spiritual element combined together, because that's the way that angels, not human eyes, can read. Now, what that thing is, we don't know, and I'm not going to speculate on it. And indeed, the same thing is true about the last verse. Here is wisdom. Let he who understands calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Huge debate has been raging, and frankly, I'll tell you that in the best of estimations, we don't know anything. Now, Fred says that in Fred's notes, he's got one reference here, Vicarious Filii Dei, which if you take the Greek letters, because the Greek letters also had numerical values, we know that pi, for example, is 314159. Each of the Greek letters had a translation into a number. If you take Vicarious Filii Dei, it does add up to 666. Quite frankly, when I see those sorts of numerology stuff, I turn around and say, I have no understanding, because this numerology stuff can be translated, retranslated so many different ways, and almost all of them come out to this idea of it being the Roman Church, as this one here does. But this number has to be associated with this beast, this image to the beast. So when it comes to that sort of numerical stuff, this end bit, my answer is we don't know anything. And the best theologians will also tell you we don't know much about those. Now, a plain text reading of the number of the beast would be related directly to this image of the beast, or probably even the second beast. but the number of a man doesn't make much sense to me. So when it comes to this last verse of the passage, God has to reveal that in his own time. And that's where chapter 13 ends. Thoughts?
In depth. Done a lot of work, mate.
It's still, I mean, the way you presented it is still what we've sort of traditionally believed, that the first beast is Catholic Church, second beast is America.
And the image to the beast is apostate Protestantism, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm simply splitting them up.
Yeah. No, very interesting, the perspectives that you brought.
Everything in the book of Revelation has led to this chapter. If you want to be really clear about it, this is the center point of Revelation. Everything has led up to this point where these decisions are made and where this choice is rolled out, and everything flows from that. The next chapter we go into, in chapter 14, is specifically about the 144,000 and the lead-in of the three angels' message. So everything leads up to this point where these people are exposed to this idea of a mark that they receive, and it's a cause that everybody has to receive it, but it's a free choice. John is very, very clear in the 3 verses there. The way that he uses the word receive makes it a free choice. Now, death comes to those who don't receive it, but death comes from starvation if you can't buy and sell things just as easily as it does the sword. It just takes a little bit longer. So, yeah, that's where I put that into play.
Yep.
Does that make sense? Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Yep.
You're now part of the conspiracy against the United States, so well done.
21 pages. How does that rate? Is that close to your longest?
I think it's about third longest. It's just a hair over 9,000 words. I think the longest was 11,000.
And how many weeks did you do that? Just 1 week?
2. Because last week I got back at 4
Got
o'clock.
back late.
Yeah.
And I couldn't. I only, in fairness, I only had, and that's kind of why I skimped out on them. When I say up here about the these bits, I had it ready to write out all these things in long sections, and I went, actually, I don't really want to bash the Catholics anymore. I've done enough, so I'll just skip over them.
Yeah.
Those bits and the bit about the mark of the beast were all I had to do this week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what? Only like 6,000 words.
This week was probably about 2,500, I'd say. But I did 6,000 before.
I thought that was pretty slack. Really?
Well, fortunately, from this point, because we've now done the history stuff, from this point we now get into the heavy theology. So it should be it's actually going to be a bit easier for me to simply write out what the thing means rather than anything else. I mean, chapter 14 just goes straight into the depths of the theology about, there's 144,000, there's 3 messages, and anybody who believes the messages is cool. And then, we all know what a harvest is because you guys are country boys. So the next ones are going to be pretty easy.
Fair enough.
Okay, can't wait.
All good?
No, all good.
Very, very good, mate. Thank you.
All right, let's end with a prayer and then I'll let you get going.
No worries.
Heavenly Father, we thank you once again that we can come together to discuss what will come to us in the future. We know that you have given us these information not to scare us like they have been used, but so that we can be absolutely sure of what the world will bring us and that we can make the right decisions when we are confronted. We know that you will never allow us to go through things without knowing what they are. We know that you will give us the power and the intellect to be able to make the right choices. And I pray that when they come to us, we may have the strength to be able to stand on your side and be able to do what you would have us do. Thank you, Lord, for these 2 good brothers that can teach me about all the things that they are in our other studies, and thank you for their influence and their will on the church that you have in Broken Hill. I pray that you'll guide and direct us all in your holy and precious name. Amen.
Amen.